Welcome to Provisional Aspirations, a podcast exploring the psychology of religion, philosophy, and clinical mental health. I'm Geoff Wallis, author, religious trauma survivor, and graduate student pursuing a master's degree in counseling psychology. Join me as I indulge my academic interest in the human spiritual experience, a curiosity that I couldn't fully explore as a member of a high-demand religious group. But now I'm learning out loud, and it feels great. Several years ago, I attended a 6-week training program designed by the religious organization that I was part of to prepare qualified members for leadership responsibilities in the group. It was pretty intense. A lot of discussion of Bible doctrine, the organization's mythology, as well as operational policy. But there was also a lot of discussion about personality. For example, putting on the mind of Christ from 1 Corinthians 2:16, and putting on the new self of Ephesians 4:24, which, according to the New American Standard Bible, in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. Regrettably, these verses were used to promote submission and obedience to the organization. Extrapolations were made to what kind of TV shows we would watch, how we would use social media, and how we would dress and groom ourselves. Regardless, at the end of the 6 weeks, we were given a small stipend and an assignment in a different state where we would assist a congregation. Naturally nervous about the upcoming assignment, I remember I was told by one of my instructors, "Just be yourself. Just be yourself." I know that I am neither the first to have received such banal advice, nor will I be the last. But after the lengths to which the curriculum had just gone to conform our thinking and behavior to biblical theology, it felt particularly inadequate. Just be yourself is not sufficiently complex for me to use as a strategy for existence. What he meant, of course, was to be genuine, authentic. These are personality styles that are valued in Western society, both inside and outside the microcosm of my religious group. Genuineness is a quality that we can easily spot when it's present in a person. And yet, if a person is not genuine, it would be very difficult to describe exactly what it is, let alone provide a framework to manifest it, to help the individual develop it. This is where Carl R. Rogers comes in, the father of person-centered psychotherapy, and his theory of congruence. But first, a little more on the challenges of being oneself. And this may resonate with any of my listeners who, like me, have been through the experience of leaving a high-demand religious group. Emerging from a collectivist group characterized by uniformity of thought tends to leave ex-members with a heightened awareness of social influence and thought conformity, not only within the religious institution itself, but also in society as a whole and the infrastructures that make up society at large. The response to the trauma of losing oneself in a totalist environment is often a dogged rejection of attempts to influence your thinking, however benign it may be. In this state of hypervigilance to manipulation, it's not easy for an individual to explore oneself and what genuineness means for them. Confounding the situation is the selflessness that can be attained through mindfulness practice, that is, perceiving and experiencing the self as an illusion in consciousness. Going one step further is the ego death experienced during psychedelic trips, wherein many report the dissolution of the self into a feeling of universal oneness. Deconstructing the illusory self in these ways can have the beneficial effect of loosening one's grip on a rigid self-concept, but it doesn't do much to answer the question of how to be genuine or authentic in real time. And then there's the paradox of assuming that you know yourself, and then basing self-representation decisions on those assumptions, communicating them by way of conceptual labels to others, only to find that the assumptions are just becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. The problem is that these illusory self-identifiers don't allow for the factor of time and the development and maturation of the self across the lifespan. In the face of change like that, then previous assumptions of the self, now plastered on a bumper sticker, or worse yet, my biggest fear, tattooed on my neck, actually then become a restriction on genuine self-expression in light of the plasticity of the self. You understand my confusion. So once again, this quandary sets the stage nicely for the congruence of Carl R. Rogers. Carl Rogers' theory of congruence and the criteria that he gives to this concept are refreshingly precise. I have found that they can be applied in real time and is a useful framework even during challenging social interactions to assure that one is behaving with congruence and also to yield place for others to do the same. Carl Rogers was a humanist psychologist, popular to lay people and therapists alike back in the 50s and 60s because of his popular writings on the subject of client-centered therapy. And his views are well esteemed even today among therapists and clinical professionals. I have the book On Becoming a Person by Carl R. Rogers, A Therapist's View of Psychotherapy. And in the introduction, written by Peter D. Kramer, MD, it says this: "It's ironic that while Rogers' ideas are in the ascendant, so much so that they are now attacked as powerful cultural assumptions in need of revision, his writings are in eclipse. This is a shame, because a culture should know where its beliefs originate, and because Rogers' writing remains lucid, charming, and accessible." End quote. And it's right, when you go back and read Rogers' work today, you'll notice that a lot of the themes that he popularized are part of the cultural zeitgeist today, particularly in self-help and conversations around mental well-being. Rogers' philosophical approach is referred to as existential humanism, a branch of existentialism that was popular in the 1940s and 1950s. According to the APA, the American Psychological Association, and I quote, "Existentialism represents a turning away from systematic philosophy, with its emphasis on metaphysical absolutes and principles of rational certainty, and towards an emphasis on the concrete existence of a human being thrown into a world that is merely given and contingent. Such a being encounters the world as a subjective consciousness, condemned to create its own meanings and values in an absurd and purposeless universe." End quote. So these comments, like the meaninglessness and purposelessness of the universe, are the reason for existentialism's reputation for being a bit dark. But existential humanism is based on this foundation, and it's an approach that gives greater weight to the inner subjective human experience. After all, if we cannot determine an overarching meaning to the world, then it's up to the individual to self-create these things. And existential humanism is based on the assumption, you might even call it a belief, that each person, each individual, has a predilection towards psychological maturation, self-understanding, and ultimately self-actualization, this concept of attaining the fullness of one's potential and talents. So despite its association with existentialism, humanism really is quite a positive theory, optimistic theory, particularly for therapeutic use. As I mentioned earlier, Rogers is best known for developing person-centered psychotherapy, what later came to be called client-centered psychotherapy. This was a paradigm shift for psychotherapy at the time, and it's the reason that why now when you go to a therapist's office, you're referred to as a client and not as a patient. Rogers acknowledged and took accountability for the power differential that occurred between the clinical professional and the individual seeking help. And he addressed this dynamic by asking of therapeutic professionals genuineness and authenticity rather than the appeal to authority that was used in the past by helping professionals. In fact, on page 30 of my copy of On Becoming a Person, there's a chapter titled, "How Can I Be of Help?" And the subtitle is, "I have found a way of working with individuals which seems to have much constructive potential." So this is the classic modest language of Carl Rogers, addressing himself as a human just like his clients. And I know what that feels like to be asked in a therapeutic room, how can I be of help? When I finally mustered the courage to seek psychiatric help for the first time, I remember being extremely apprehensive in the office. And the psychiatrist looked me in the eye and said, "How can I help?" Which was incredibly refreshing at the time, although I was struggling and everybody in my life knew it. This was the first time anybody had asked how they could help. And this is squarely based on the Rogerian approach to therapy. Rogers puts it this way in On Becoming a Person. He says, "Thus we can say with some assurance that a relationship characterized by a high degree of congruence or genuineness in the therapist, by a sensitive and accurate empathy on the part of the therapist, by a high degree of regard, respect, liking for the client by the therapist, and by an absence of conditionality in this regard, will have a high probability of being an effective therapeutic relationship. End quote. You'll notice in that passage the three criteria that would go on to become the foundation for Rogerian therapy or client-centered therapy. The first criteria being a sensitive and accurate empathy, that is really learning the experience of the client and feeling it at a certain level. The second is what has come to be referred to as universal positive regard, that is a liking for the client by the therapist, as he says in this passage, an absence of conditionality in this regard, universal positive regard. It doesn't matter what you do in the therapy room, the therapist has to like you. That's what you pay him for. And the third, which I will be focusing on for the remainder of this episode, a high degree of congruence or genuineness in the therapist. So in sum, these are the three requirements of client-centered therapy: empathy, universal positive regard, and congruence on the part of the therapist. What's interesting here is that congruence is not identified as a goal of the therapy, but rather a requirement for the therapist. Rogers explains that when a therapist seeks to understand the challenges of the client and truly absorb them at the experiential level, he or she will be changed at the psychological level. In a sense, the therapeutic relationship becomes an opportunity for the therapist to develop their own genuineness. Being truly present in the therapy room will lead to psychological maturity in the helping professional and also deepen their ability to be congruent in every interaction, whether it's therapeutic or otherwise. So what Rogers is saying here is that attempting to perform psychotherapy with congruence leads to greater congruence in both the therapist and the client. This is the magic of Rogerian therapy. And by magic, I mean social affective neuroscience. But the scientist that he is, of course, Rogers removed himself from his humanist beliefs and tested them time and time again to show the effectiveness of these three elements of psychotherapy. And he wrote extensively about how this framework could be applied to creativity, education, and even foreign policy. In fact, Rogers goes so far as to title Chapter 18 in his book On Becoming a Person, a tentative formulation of a general law of interpersonal relationships. Fortunately, when it comes to genuineness, Rogers doesn't just tell us to be ourselves, but rather provides a robust definition of congruence. He puts it this way, and I quote, "With one individual, we recognize that he not only means exactly what he says, but that his deepest feelings also match what he is expressing. Thus, whether he is angry or affectionate or ashamed or enthusiastic, we sense that he is the same at all levels, in what he is experiencing at an organismic level, in his awareness at the conscious level, and in his words and communications. We know exactly where he stands, and we tend to feel comfortable and secure in such a relationship." Did you notice there the three criteria of congruence? That there would be a matching of three elements of the human experience. Number one, he says the experience at the organismic level, that is our sensation of affect and emotion and essences of the mind. That would match our awareness at a conscious level, that is that we would have enough psychological sophistication to be able to notice such sensations and interpret them accurately. And finally, that bodily and linguistic communication would be in harmony with the organismic experience and the interpretation of that experience in consciousness. To explain the concept further, Rogers gives two examples. He says, and I quote, "Perhaps the simplest example is an infant. If he's experiencing hunger at the physiological and visceral level, then his awareness appears to match this experience, and his communication is also congruent with this experience. He is hungry and dissatisfied, and this is true of him at all levels. He is one unified person all the way through, whether we tap his experience at the visceral level, the level of his awareness, or the level of communication." End quote. Conversely, to demonstrate incongruence, Rogers gives the example of a group of men having a discussion, and one man getting angry because his point of view is not being heard by the rest of the group. And his friend says to him, well, let's not get angry about this. And then the individual replies with surprise, I'm not getting angry. I don't feel anything at all about this. Well, it's obvious then that this person is out of congruence. If tapped at multiple levels of their experience, we will not find harmony. Rogers firmly seats his theory of congruence in the existential foundation, which is an important part of being congruent and genuine in a practical sense, pragmatically in social interactions. He says this, if an individual is at this moment entirely congruent, his actual physiological experience being accurately represented in his awareness, and his communication being accurately congruent with his awareness, then his communication could never contain an expression of an external fact. If he was congruent, he could not say, that rock is hard, he is stupid, you are bad, or she is intelligent. The reason for this is that we never experience such facts. Accurate awareness of experience would always be expressed as feelings, perceptions, meanings from an internal frame of reference. I never know that he is stupid or you are bad. I can only perceive that you seem this way to me. Likewise, strictly speaking, I do not know that the rock is hard, even though I may be very sure that I experience it as hard if I fall down on it. If the person is thoroughly congruent, then it is clear that all of his communication would necessarily be put in a context of personal perception. End quote. The beauty and magic of congruence that we mentioned earlier is reiterated by Rogers himself when he says, the greater the congruence of experience, awareness, and communication on the part of one individual, the more the ensuing relationship will involve a tendency toward reciprocal communication with a quality of increasing congruence, a tendency toward more mutually accurate understanding of the communications, improved psychological adjustment and functioning in both parties, mutual satisfaction in the relationship. These are surely worthy relationship goals. But lest we get too romantic about this concept, Rogers does go on to identify the natural roadblock to congruence, and that is self-defense. Rogers puts it this way. He asks, do I dare to communicate myself as I am, or must my communication be somewhat less than or different from this? The sharpness of this issue lies in the often vividly foreseen possibility of threat or rejection. To communicate one's full awareness of the relevant experience is a risk in interpersonal relationships. It seems to me that it is the taking or not taking of this risk which determines whether a given relationship becomes more and more mutually therapeutic or whether it leads in a disintegrative direction. End quote. This is the existential responsibility of each individual, the choice as to whether their communication will in fact be congruent or whether they must use defense. Thank you, Carl Rogers, for your comprehensive theory on how to be yourself. I like Rogers' theory of congruence, and I don't find it too Pollyanna for use in real life. Pragmatically speaking, there are some relationships where truth-telling and genuineness is not to our benefit. Anybody who has worked in business, negotiation, sales, knows that this is the case. Or for anybody that has been a physically in, mentally out member of a captive organization, you know that this is often the case too. But just because one holds back from communicating the full expression of their personal experience doesn't mean that they are not congruent. It is possible, of course, to be fully present with effective sensations and essences of the mind and have an accurate understanding of these experiences and awareness, and then choose to communicate in a way that is out of harmony with those two facts. This is the existential choice that Rogers mentions in his theory. And we know that this has pragmatic benefit when it does come to meaningful self-defense, or also if one is playing power games and using power tactics to strategically advance oneself in an arena. This is a context where the existential choice to be less than congruent could have some pragmatic benefit in the short term. But Rogers' theory is most useful, of course, in the therapeutic relationship, but also in other human relationships that we would like to have healing elements to them. Our closest human interactions, where we desire to be our truest selves and to experience the healing potential of that congruence. Rogers' theory also allows for the benefits of mindfulness in attaining the first two levels of congruence. During meditation, a mindfulness practitioner has the opportunity to focus their awareness on the sensory perception of emotional experience. Distance from this emotional perception can be attained during meditation so that the individual can more accurately interpret it in consciousness. Then the mindful approach can be extended beyond meditation to our normal waking consciousness and incorporated with Rogers' framework for congruence when interacting in real time with others. Also, congruence doesn't deny the necessity of social pragmatism. It allows for the use of silence and assertive communication skills to affect meaningful outcomes in our social environment. And of course, when these skills are performed discerningly, it can alleviate much psychological distress at the individual level. Congruence requires a daring willingness to explore our psychological defenses, the depth of our emotional experience, and to analyze the honesty of our communication with others. Turns out that there's a little bit more involved to just being yourself. Thanks to Carl Rogers for breaking it down. Thanks for joining me on Provisional Aspirations. If you liked the discussion, please leave a review on your podcast app, and don't forget to follow on Instagram, Medium, and YouTube for breakdowns from the show. Thanks, and I'll catch you next time.